Sanid Somalia, one idin hisi dona.
Hi everyone, welcome to an exclusive interview with Kate Foster, UK Ambassador to Somalia. Kate, welcome to Goobjoog.
Thank you.
I would like to start. Can you give us an overview on UK and Somali relations?
Yeah, that's right. So the UK and Somalia are a long-term partnership, and that's really important to us as UK. So going back to the first Somalia conference back in 2012, since then a second conference in 2017, the UK has taken on the role of championing Somalia in the international community around the debt relief process, and also has the privilege of holding the pen on Somalia in the UN Security Council. So for us, really, this relationship's about supporting Somalia and Somalis to thrive, to develop, so become more resilient to things like climate change or the threat from terrorists, to support your population to become well educated, especially girls, to have improved health, and to support the development of more productive and higher quality jobs for its population.
You are about to leave the post as a UK Ambassador to Somalia. During your tenure, what are the bigger achievements you can share with us?
Yeah, it's been an interesting period to be here, and obviously the first 18 months was very much caught up in the national election process. So there's probably three things that I would highlight. I think that the country came out of the back of that very contested national election process and had still hit the key timing milestones on the IMF programme was really important. Not my achievement, the achievement of Somalia, but it meant that the door was still open for Somalia to be able to access really transformational levels of financing for its health and education sector. Secondly, that Somalia was able to avert a famine in 2022, and I think that's down to the collective effort of the leadership of the government here, but also the support and response of international partners. But that fight isn't over, and the challenge may be even bigger in 2023 as we head into a failed rainy season. So it's going to be an area where we will need to encourage the same level of focus, attention and international support. And then the third area, it was really nice for me and a real privilege actually to be able to do my farewell meetings with the President while he was working out of Baidoa, and to take him to see some of the training that we have been doing down there since 2019 and have the opportunity to show him around that facility.
Kate, come to Somalia at a time where the country's political instability. To call him back, what the challenges can you highlight the worst you are witnessing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really big challenge of that period, that election process ran, I think, probably in total for around 2 years. And that meant that Somalia's leaders were looking internally at issues here within the country and between the political elite. And there were many challenges affecting the lives of Somalis, and those probably for the majority of people were not the key issues. So it meant that it was very difficult for the country to continue to progress on its pathway towards development around some of that economic progress, around responding to the humanitarian situation, to the needs of the population, to the challenges of climate change. So I think it's good that we are now through that process and an opportunity to look forward. And I really want to commend actually Somalia's leaders, even at the most difficult moments. I learned and experienced how much that even when people disagree, they tend to find channels to talk to one another. And I think those sort of traditional mechanisms around dialogue and seeking a pathway to consensus are really important, and what got the country through that really challenging moment in time.
As a supportive international partner, Somalia, what have you learned from Somalia's election 2020-2022?
Yeah, so I think I really hear the desire from a lot of Somalis that they want to move towards a process that is more rules-based, more transparent, more open and more democratic. And I think the focus over the coming years should be continuing a move towards a more democratic one-person, one-vote elections. And there are some things that we can learn from the pilot district council elections were experienced in Puntland. I think the levels of turnout and registration in those first 3 pilot districts, the fact that women really engaged in that process and voted in higher proportions, I think, to men, shows that they see an important role for their voice in the future of Somalia. And I think for us, we would also mention that I think we would be keen to see a process where it is possible for women to compete more openly and more fairly. If you look around the world, countries where women form a larger part of government or parliament, those countries on the whole are more stable, they are more productive, and they're countries that are better able to address tensions when they do arise. So it is 50% of the population, and I think Somalia would be better for more inclusively having women's voice as part of the political process.
Somalia is in battle with Al-Shabaab and liberate many towns. What is the UK's support in terms of fight to liberate terrorist group from Somalia?
I really want to commend the leadership that we've seen from the federal government as well as from federal member state presidents down to district governors right down to the community level in really stepping up and committing to the fight against Al-Shabaab, as well as the efforts of those of Somalia's security forces who are on the front line and at community levels really taking that fight to Al-Shabaab. As a security partner here as the UK, we provide support across a range of areas. So that includes training of the Somali National Army, so that's basic infantry training, that we provide support and training and stipends to the Somali police, who are probably going to be part of the sort of future of holding territory. We provide logistical support, things like medical evacuation, casualty evacuation, to around 10,000 Somali security forces. That's working through the UN Trust Fund, which provides that logistical support and food and rations. But we're also part of working very closely with the government as they continue to develop things like the national security architecture. So to work through what the institutions of government also look like, how these structures work in the medium term, what is the right size of the security forces, how are they commanded and governed, and how are they affordable as well.
UK trains securities in southwest Somalia. Will you clarify the leadership structure of that soldiers? Will they come under government or Somalia or UK?
We train the Somali National Army. We just happen to be training them out in southwest state in Baidoa. So ultimately we see responsibility for those troops sits with the Chief of the Defence Force and the Minister of Defence here at the federal government level.
Somalia wants to lift arms embargo, and UK are a member of the countries who are concerned on it. What is your consensus?
Yeah, so I think the sanctions resolution in the Security Council is relatively poorly understood actually. So it is a sanctions resolution that focuses on reducing Al-Shabaab's ability to access weapons, ammunition and capability. There is not an arms embargo on the government of Somalia, and the government of Somalia is able to access the support it needs in the fight against Al-Shabaab. And actually the changes, the updates that were made to the resolution that passed through the Security Council in November were the biggest changes in reducing the complexity for the federal government in being able to access weapons and ammunition through partners, and the biggest tightening of sanctions and targets on Al-Shabaab that we have seen, I think, in about 10 years. What we're really committed to as the UK is continuing to work with the government, particularly to work through and build some of the capabilities around weapons and ammunition management, in particularly both at federal government and member state level, which has been one of the requests of the UN Security Council and the panel of experts, where they are keen to see the structures and processes around those improve and be enhanced.
Somalia is struggling to achieve a debt relief milestone. How UK supporting?
Yeah, so the UK has been the debt relief champion since Somalia has sort of started on this pathway. And I think probably actually over the last 5 or so years, it is one of the biggest successes of Somalia and been an almost transformational change in terms of economic reform processes and commitments. So I think I really want to recognise the work that's happened to date. 2023 is a big year as Somalia potentially moves towards completion point, and I think we'd continue to encourage the government to stick and adhere to that pathway of economic reforms, of transparency, of good governance and finance. And we remain really committed to working with the government, with the World Bank, with the IMF and other partners to raise the profile of the work that Somalia is doing in this area and to ensure that there continues to be coordinated international support.
Somalia expects to produce oil and gas. So what is the UK position on that move?
Yeah, so we're really aware of the potential benefit of oil and gas for Somalia and the potential resources that could come down the line. I think the UK has been through a bit of an oil and gas transformation of its own, having explored oil and gas off the North Sea coast of the UK. And there were probably two areas that we have particularly learnt from that and where we would encourage the government and other partners to think about as this process moves forward. So firstly, I think that's about getting the best for the people of Somalia out of contracts and awards. So there are some really strong processes that have been established by the federal government, the Ministry of Finance, and with partners such as the World Bank around commercial procurement contracts. And I'd really continue to encourage the government as it's working through awarding oil and gas contracts to use those procedures because they provide a degree of transparency and also ensure that contracts are commercially competitive. So that's about how Somalia gets the best out of any deal for its people and how those resources are used to support the development of the country. And then the second point is that oil and gas exploration is really a long-term business. So even when a contract is signed, in practical terms, it's going to take years, possibly 10 to 15, before the company that's done the exploration has recovered its costs and before the government starts to see revenues come into its coffers. So I'd also say, think about the other options, and this is where in particular as the UK that we are really keen to support development in a wider range of energy sectors. So in particular, Somalia is lucky enough to have an almost untapped potential to solar power. And of course, exploring that and using that potential is greener, it's better for the planet, and we're an area which can be relatively low cost and transformational. So for us as the UK, that's the area where we're likely to prioritise our support over the coming years.
The government of Somalia is trying to become part of East Africa community. So how can UK support on that efforts?
Yeah, and it's a really great ambition, and actually it's good to talk to you on the day that the East Africa Community Verification Team have arrived here in Mogadishu, and I know had the opening meeting with the federal government. So we absolutely see that as a really positive thing and a recognition of the progress and steps that the government has taken over the past years. I think building trading relationships with neighbours can only be a good thing, both in terms of increasing the trading opportunities and income and revenue for Somalia. But the stronger your trading relationships, the stronger your political and diplomatic relationships between countries, which means that countries tend to be more stable because you have a shared set of interests. So it's something that we absolutely support. We've been in close contact with the federal government special envoy for the EAC and are working closely to ensure that we can provide support where it's needed. So particularly one of our programs which is working on customs reform and harmonisation and processes and transparency around ports in Kismayo, Mogadishu and Basato. And that's one of the verification areas that this mission will be looking at. So it's through targeted programming and support that we seek to help ensure that we can help the government to meet the benchmarks and standards that are going to be required for accession.
Soon you will leave your ambassador job in Somalia. What experience will you remember in Somalia?
So it's been a challenging but fascinating time that I have been here in Somalia. And I think mostly I will go away with memories of the very open and often robust conversations that I've had with Somalis from every level in this country, be that at the senior most political leaders, down to individuals like yourself working with different journalist groups and unions, civil society organisations, to listening to girls in schools in Dolo and hearing their aspirations. But mostly what I've really enjoyed actually has been the directness of some of that conversation. I think Somalis are very clear to tell you what they think, but actually that can be very helpful as someone who has come in, because it helps us work out how we best support, how we best understand the issues. So I think I've really appreciated the time that people have taken to share their views, to exchange ideas, and I think that makes us better as a partner to Somalia here.
During your time in Somalia, you have been interacting with the diverse Somali communities, and have you learned Somali language? Could you tell us some Somali words you can speak or can share with us? Have you listened to Somali music?
So I've tried to learn some Somali because I think it is good to do that as a sign of respect for the country in which you're posted. I'm not sure I've done a very good job, and when I was down in Baidoa a few days ago and was with President Hassan Sheikh down in the training centre in Baidoa, I made my speech in Somali. And I asked had a translator who was going to translate my bad Somali into better Somali, and he was like, no, it's fine, I don't need to translate. But I think he was probably just being a bit polite. So mostly I have focused on things like greetings and meetings, and sort of perhaps opening and ending meetings with just a few words of Somali. And I've heard a lot of poetry. And I've really enjoyed that actually, and then has listened to things like Somali radio, sort of spoken word, as part of understanding, I think, sounds and pronunciation, which are very difficult. So perhaps for me, I will say as sort of parting words to Somalia, Nabadgelyo, io madsanid Somalia, wan idin hisi dona.
Thank you, Kate. That's the end of our interview.
Madsante.